Welcome to the New York Times podcast, your I Rest My Case of music news and criticism. I'm your host, John Caramonica.
You're so late getting home from the office. Did you miss your train? Were you caught in the rain?
It's the end of the year, which means really it's the beginning of the year, which means we are looking back at 2022 still, which means it's the year in jazz. Every wintertime, when the weather is cold, we look back at the last 12 months. Sometimes we do it in between, but we're doing it now to talk about 2022 in jazz. There's a lot to cover. First, it's Gio Russonello. Gio covers jazz for us, checking in from an undisclosed location this week. Gio, what's good, man?
How you doing, John? Thank you for the non-disclosure.
We are a protector of secrets, not state secrets, but, personal secrets. We are protectors of personal secrets on podcast. Joining us, first time on podcast, Harmony Holiday is here. Harmony is an essayist and a poet, writes for Freeze, 4 columns, books of poetry, et cetera, et cetera. First time, Harmony, welcome to podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Excited to have both of you here. You can check out Gio's list on the Times website. Harmony has come armed with a list as well. One point of overlap between those two lists is who we were listening to at the beginning of the episode. That's Samara Joy with Guess Who I Saw Today. This is from Linger a While, a major label debut on Verve. Gio, the first thing that you say in your blurb about this album, which I think is maybe number 6 on your list, you called it a rite of passage. And to me, that is potentially a fraught term. It feels like, is it an obstacle as much as it is a rite of passage? So I wonder if we can kind of kick off the conversation about this album by talking through why is an album of this nature a rite of passage, and what are the positive and negative connotations for a singer like Samara Joy?
I think you are accurately reading between the lines on that phrase. When I say rite of passage, I guess I was alluding to the notion that for singers, especially in jazz vocalists, an album like this, where you do the standards and you really run through the songbook and you display your talents over this tried and true repertoire, ought to feel something like an obligation, like a ticket that you're stamping on your way to maybe more fertile or more personal creative terrain. For Samara Joy, I don't think that's necessarily not true, but I also don't think it mattered as much, because this album was just like kind of a mind-bending celebration of what one preternaturally talented person can do with this songbook. And she did it in a different way than, for instance, Cecile McLaurin-Salvant, somebody else who had a great record this year and who until now had been completely known for her relationship with this tradition and her role in both celebrating that songbook, that classic American songbook, and also expanding upon it. Her work has only gotten better and better as she's moved outward from there, into more personal places. Samara Joy is still, I think, only 23, if I've got that right, has a lot of exciting things ahead of her. But I think what took me by surprise was that this, only her second album, her first under a major spotlight, was just so fun to listen to. I mean, just listening to her go all the way down and all the way up, listening to her write lyrics to, a Fats Navarro melody from the 40s. It was just a reminder that not everything needs to be shiny in order to be new.
Harmony, what do you make of the embrace of and pushback on tradition on this album and in Samara's work more broadly?
I love it, first of all, because I think that it's kind of brave to try to sing standards that people have mastered so many times over to make them new again. And then the pushback, I don't know. I don't feel that there is much pushback. I feel like this is pretty straight ahead in my estimation of it.
We think about an album like this as a first step in what we imagine will be like a long and illustrious career. Do you feel like this sets the contours of what the shape of that career will be? Or is it something that has to be done to kind of demonstrate to quote unquote serious jazz fans that, yes, this is someone who should be reckoned with because of how they engage with the history?
On one level, I think it does do that contouring. It brings in the accompanists that she's able to then tap into for the rest of her career and point to as like points of access, but also people that she is in conversation with as she goes on to do maybe looser things or write her own compositions and things like that. I don't think that upcoming singers are trying to flatter tradition as much. Like, I feel like that was like back in the day. I think of like Abby Lincoln's early albums and, you know, old school singers' early albums where they had to do the songbook. And I don't think that's a thing now. That's what I think is disruptive about it in a cool way, that people are sort of abandoning that and moving toward newer, freer interpretations, like Melanie Charles or something, like where you're remixing the songbook with your own interpretive skills. So it's almost daring to go back and do something more straight ahead like this.
Can we talk a little bit about her voice? Because I found her voice really striking, like the flexibility and crispness kind of interplaying with each other. Samara Joy, if I'm not mistaken, was nominated for a Grammy Best New Artist this year.
Yeah.
Which is regrettably my first engagement with her. But I did a deep dive then and another deep dive in prep for this and a couple of like her television appearances. And I was very, very struck with kind of like the casual intensity of the way that she was singing.
For me, the coincidence is that I think she won a couple of years ago the Sarah Vaughan vocal competition, which has recently become sort of a real proving ground for young jazz vocalists. And then at the same time, the name that everyone always has to drop when they think about Samara Joy's singing is Sarah Vaughan, because it was Sassy, as she was known, who had that kind of rich as molasses, very fluid, but also extremely sturdy presentation as a vocalist. She was able to do the melismas at basically any part of her range, and then just soar, scatting, completely rearranging and retrofitting a melody. These are like the classic skills that she and Ella Fitzgerald, especially those two from a vocal athleticism standpoint, but so many singers from the mid-century really took to a high point. It's just cool to hear somebody doing it with all of the jazz school knowledge, all of the literate familiarity with a diminished scale or with ascending thirds or whatever technicalities she might be dealing with on a given song. But like Harmony was saying, kind of retaining that boldness to step into something that's already been done, so to speak, and to basically say, I embrace the tradition, I embrace the sound of my forebears even, I embrace the hyper-extended technicality of my generation of jazz musicians who came up going to places like the New School or Berkeley or whatever. And then at the end of all of that, I deliver it with this sense of like pure joy. She's one of those singers. I think of Christy Dashiell, who's also a singer of this younger generation. She's a vocalist who's probably in her 30s at this point. She's from my hometown of DC, and she's somebody who you hear with a smile on her face every time she sings. You can just like literally hear it, you know, that this person is giving you a form of personal joy in the singing. And I think that for Samara Joy, there's this willingness to be free in that feeling that I think in a time like now is pretty rare and part of maybe what refreshes us about going back into this tradition.
Gio brings up a good point. The people who've been through New School in Berkeley have a lot of almost like decanting to do. They can't be like Miles Davis and quit. So it's like, I feel like that's sort of part of our current jazz tradition right now, is going through that training because it is one of the rites of passage, and then coming out of it and trying to sound like you aren't trained, that effortless feeling that dancers almost accrue. So it's a different time in that sense. And it's interesting bringing that up. I first heard Samara Joy on TikTok. I was just like watching clips of her singing in amazement. And it was like a year ago when she really only had like random straight clips and a few different things and non-major label albums. Part of that decanting is also helped by the weird casualness of social media interactions that just enjam everything.
Can I just sidebar briefly? What's going on with jazz vocals on TikTok? What's the energy there?
For her, the energy is lit, but I think she's one of the, you know, the darlings. I don't know that it's a big thing I go on TikTok for like French style videos, and I happen to come across.
We have very different algos, but that's, I'm glad to know that timeline also exists, even if I'm not accessing it. I'm glad to know it exists. Gio, I'm glad you mentioned Cecile. Cecile had your number one album this year, which is Ghost Song. And if you don't mind, if I can pick the song, because this was probably my favorite Cecile album. And I was really excited to listen to it. Can we hear a little bit of Optimistic Voices? It's Optimistic Voices / No Love Dying, but the first section of it, Optimistic Voices. Let's listen to a little bit of that.
You're out of the woods, you're out of the dark, you're out of the night. Step into the sun, step into the light. Keep straight ahead for the most glorious place on the face of the earth or the sky. Hold on to your heads, hold on to your hearts, hold on to your hopes. March into that gate and bid it open.
It was hard for me, Gio, not to read your kind of like rite of passage canon and not think of Cecile separately, who is a singer, at least for me, who I've sort of always been maybe like awed by, like from a technical perspective, but not always like loved or felt gravitationally pulled towards. And this album felt looser, more charming, a lot of diversity in approach. And I really was engaged by what was happening vocally on this record. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more at length about this album, and especially at this stage of her career, what Cecile has done or maybe had to do to arrive at this place.
I think I shared your feeling that I was often impressed by her and completely floored sometimes by her ability and her intellect and the way that she went into the archive and kind of pulled things out of crannies that we might not have even thought to look into or known existed. But then at the same time feeling like, well, okay, where are you in this? What as an artist am I missing? Why does this not feel fully exposed, perhaps emotionally? And I think in some way I was asking the wrong questions. I think I was making a judgment about whether a musician can be a historian, an archivist, a critic, a vocalist first, and then perhaps, a generous, emotive artist later. Maybe that is okay. What this new album did is, I think it sort of gave me what I thought I wanted, but not in the ways I thought I wanted it, if that makes sense. Like, I think she kind of stayed exactly where she was as an archivist, as a critic, as a historiographer, like a really brilliant investigator of these histories, of these never completed conversations, you might say, by doing Bertolt Brecht next to a weird but also loving letter that Stieglitz wrote to Georgia O'Keeffe, next to some originals, next to a Kate Bush. This is Cecile McLaurin Salvant. This is what she's been doing, but she did it in a bigger, more expansive, and also, yes, more personal way. She said that this album was her attempt to turn the pages of her diary, which are also her lyric book, which are also a sketchbook, which are also where she keeps, random stray notes that she might scribble down while she's at the Met, turn that into the album, and she hasn't done that before. She's always been, okay, well, here's my relationship, or here's a relationship to an archive. And that's more of a codified, Great American Songbook or Stevie Wonder. But now this is sort of like the MTV Cribs album. I feel like she's like, come in. This is where I sleep. This is how I, cut onions for the omelet that I'm about to make. This is my pet. His name is Pebbles. I don't know. This felt like we are in Cecile's world, and she's really letting us be there with her. But it didn't feel like, oh, now you're just a wide open book with an emotional narrative. It's like you're still the kind of master of a remove, the critical thinker, but it just feels like she's completely freed herself in that role.
I think it's nice that after maybe a more removed series of albums, we get this like unexpected intimacy, but that doesn't violate her clear boundaries, as a human being. And I think that's part of something I keep thinking about just in current new jazz music and jazz vocals, there's this institutionalization of the music, especially early in a career of a jazz singer. It becomes necessary to pay a lot of homage to that because that's just like sort of maybe what you're trying to wrap your head around. And it's maybe less in other artistic disciplines because jazz is so much relicized, if that's even a word. You know what I mean?
It is now. It is now.
Yeah. And so the fact that she's had to work through this many years to get out of that, I think is a testament. It's not just like a personality thing. It might be an industry thing. And it's cool that she made her way here.
Yeah. Can we talk? Yeah, the industry thing. And I don't mean to like sort of circle around this, but I do wonder the degree to which the demands of an industry, which, you know, Gio, I feel like we talk about every year, once or twice a year, is in some form of self-examination to peril arc somewhere in there. To what degree are those industry/commercial demands squelching the potential freedom that some of these singers, and obviously people who don't sing as well, instrumentalists, to what degree is it squelching the freedom? Or maybe the corollary question is it favoring people who can play that game more effectively, who have a more intimate relationship with the songbook, with tradition?
For my part, I think it's hard to make a broad statement along those lines. What's been interesting to see is that we're kind of in the like post rubble era of the music industry, right? At least as far as we know it. Whatever happens in the future, God forbid, one of the many things I expect to happen do. But I just think that sorry, I just don't have a super warm and fuzzy feeling about the future of the music industry with a capital M. But the world that we're dealing with is one that's already gone through multiple implosions. We had the CD bubble in the 2000s. It hasn't really been better since then, but I think the Spotify is itself like a constant implosion in terms of musicians' rights and their ability to control their own destiny and to make any decent money off of it. Real estate markets getting so bad in all these cities has actually meant that like musicians are in many ways quite unhoused, whether it comes to performance or studio space or even just housing. So yeah, like we're in a very difficult time. But what's been interesting is there is still a Samara Joy record on Verve, which is a major label subsidiary. There is still a Melanie Charles record on Verve. So we're looking at opportunities here and there for musicians who come out of this postmodern jazz world where, yes, you learn the skills, you learn the technique, and then you basically, like Harmony was saying, don't necessarily have to do the standards. You can kind of do what you like. There is still a place for them to go to a certain degree. There's still, to the extent that there's a top of the ladder anywhere, you know, commercially, it's still in some ways available to jazz musicians. But it doesn't seem to be in any way considerable enough of an opportunity to be guiding people's decisions. If you're a jazz musician coming up now, that means you can kind of go wherever and expect you're either going to get very lucky or you're going to have to catch as catch can, do it alongside other things.
What you're basically saying is you have as good a shot doing it the sort of like straight and narrow old fashioned way as doing it in a more like progressive, like basically because everything is so kind of like desiccated at this point, you're not risking anything by risking.
I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah. And I think it's just nice to know that there is still some space for quote unquote commercial success as a jazz musician amidst a landscape where that just is so small of an opportunity that it doesn't really even matter. I just see musicians making their own way. I see like a really serious efflorescence of indie labels, whether it's International Anthem or Edition Records or 577. There's just like so many good and I think relatively new indie labels coming up to support scenes. Musicians are sort of putting their own stuff out. Obviously, Bandcamp, despite, you know, the new ownership, continues to be like a huge haven for musicians. And I just think jazz continues to be a music of self-determination.
Gio, given what you were just talking about, I actually feel like that's an interesting entry point into a record, Harmony, that you had mentioned on your list, which is this Gene Carn record, part of a Jazz is Dead series. This is a record made in collaboration with Adrian Young and Ali Shaheed Muhammad. Do you want to tell a little bit about Gene Carn as a singer and her backstory, and then kind of like how this album is situated in the current ecosystem?
Jean recorded a couple late 60s, I think, or early 70s album with her then husband, Doug Karn, that were sort of iconic spiritual jazz fixtures for me, at least, when I found that side of the music, Spirit of the New Land. And there's another one with these iconic like covers of them in caftans. And it was very much like 60s revolutionary jazz meets spiritual jazz into the 70s feel that I just really loved. I love her voice. It is definitely pre this period of training, but has that virtuosic ability to move through registers and scales as if she'd gone through all these years of schooling. I don't know if actually, I don't know her school background. I just know as far as her singing, it sounds like weathered, but also trained in this really interesting way. And then, slight disclaimer, I really don't like Jazz is Dead as a title. So I was conflicted about putting this on the list, but I really wanted to pay homage to her as like a way older vocalist who is still doing really great work, especially on this album, given like the mantle to record in the way that I think she should be recorded, because some of the stuff, this is on Bandcamp, but some of the stuff you find on Spotify of her that she's tried to record in recent years, which I think is a thing that happens a lot. One of my favorite, I've already mentioned her, Abby Lincoln, like you see later recordings of especially female vocalists, and it just seems like they didn't have like infrastructure to be able to do what they were hearing for whatever reason. It's almost like people like treat them like they're pat or something, or like it's cute. Like the recordings are like a pat on the head. And this was actually like her given a proper studio, proper production. And so it sounds amazing, but particularly like some of the weirder, almost like Pentecostal sounding vocals, Black Rainbows. And then there's like People of the Sun that are just sort of like this mix of praise and speaking in tongues and jazz singing that I tend to really love, that people call spiritual jazz.
Let's listen to a little bit of Black Rainbows. Casually tabling things should not be called such and such as dead.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, this is like, I feel this about, hip hop is dead.
Just the trendiness of it. It's like a way to package things that is hip but gratuitous.
And also, it's like, if you're calling something dead, it's like, what are you calling the thing dead? The thing that actually provided the nourishment for you to invent the new idea that you then innovate. It's like, it's washed. It's washed. Don't do it. If you're listening to Popcast and you're in a position to title albums, don't do this. Just don't do it. But so tabling that conversation, this album is part of a series. They just put out a Phil Ranelin record. Could we talk a little bit more about, and I know that Adrian and Ali Shah Muhammad, maybe there's another album in the series that they worked on. What's happening in this space to even create the circumstance to give a singer like Jean Carn this kind of attention, as you point out?
It's sort of a multi-layered operation. Adrian owns some space in Highland Park. It's a neighborhood in Los Angeles that's quickly gentrifying. It used to be like mostly Mexican, Latino neighborhood, and now a lot of like artists are moving in because of what Gio mentioned about real estate. I think that's the cycle of gentrification as we know it. So there are a lot of like hip spots, and his is like a barber shop, I think, in the front, and then there's like radio recordings there, and then in the back there's a studio. They are doing good work. They're making a lot of albums using this space, and then there's a venue not far away where they started out their concert series, and they've been bringing all sorts of people, international artists like Milton Nascimento, and then people like Jean Carn, who some would call forgotten people in the jazz canon that they are shedding new light on. And they have created like a really brilliant hype factory in that sense, where like younger audiences, because of like the name Ali Shaheed Muhammad or whoever they're latching onto as like the reason that they're being able to vet this music that they'd never heard of, now are going to see people in the series who they probably wouldn't go see otherwise. The series is vast and rich. And I think, you could sort of forgive the the titling a little bit.
Should we just print up little stickers that say "not" and just put them in between the "is" and "dead" and just like stick them on all the physical copies?
Absolutely, yeah. Graffiti is needed.
Gio, I think this beggars the question: how dead is jazz, really? Like, let's just put it out there, man. No one's listening. It's just me and you here. It's just me and you
Throwing
here.
up in my mouth.
Sorry,
Okay.
sorry. No.
Well, that doesn't taste good.
Talk about this series. Yeah, talk about this series of records.
I think we need to have a meta commentary in the form of a 500-page edited academic book on "Is the question jazz is dead yet?" There's a number of things that I think are really cool about this series, and not to be too ice cold about it, but like the records are not always the coolest thing about this series, because I feel like a lot of these records are noodle sessions where there's like not a lot of direction creatively, and like they're in the studio and they're messing around and they're not really getting very far. That said, what they're doing is they're on a journey, and I'm really excited about it. They're welcoming all these legendary musicians who, as Harmony mentions, have often been sort of like not forgotten about, because there's a lot of us out here that remember these people, but like absolutely neglected for the past 30 or 40 years. They've also got this space, right, which is a huge part of what makes this moment in creative Black music, quote unquote jazz, whatever you want to call it, very exciting, which is that musicians are picking up on a lost tradition of defining space for themselves and defining the environments of their own creativity. So you've got musicians often partnering with maybe some people who are a little bit more on the business side or whatever, really creating either studios or empty spaces where they can really do their thing. I think there's an album that's about to come out from the Total Refreshment Center in London, which is a curiously named creative space that's really given rise to a lot of the exciting stuff that's happening out in the London scene. So I love that Ali Shaheed Muhammad and Adrian Young, who have pop and hip hop fame and don't necessarily need to be doing anything like this, have decided that the legacy of the 60s and the 70s, as embodied by these great creative musicians, is one that they want to go back to. And I would agree with you that the Jean Carn record is a highlight. Somehow she just kind of like erupts on this record. She really like has, you mentioned that Pentecostal thing and like kind of that early spiritual jazz era thing, and like it transcends the limitations of the noodle fest that, you know, I think these albums often are, just because she doesn't really take a lot of time to get to her point. She's there and ready to go. For anybody interested in what this duo is doing, Ali Shaheed Muhammad and Adrian Young, I feel like that album is a really good place to start. And then I think just stay tuned, because the environment they're creating out there and the opportunity that they're creating for generations to meet is bound to result in even more exciting stuff.
Gio, can I use this as an opportunity to pivot to something that we were texting about earlier, which is that I feel like your list, there's less quote unquote weird stuff, I think is the term that I used on your list than sometimes there sometimes has been in the past. And I don't know if that's because my ears are not tuned correctly for weirdness or if it's reflecting something more broad. There are some noodly records on your list, or records that are certainly far less conventional than, you know, Cecile or Samara. I'm thinking of the Fred Moten record. I'm thinking of More Mother, of course.
There's a difference between a serious improvisation and a noodle.
Yeah.
Let us get our definitions straight. There's a difference between a feeling and a vibe.
Yeah.
You know, these are different things.
Yes, that's why I throw you these questions so that you can kick the answer back. So, talk to me about weird stuff this year.
Man, the weird stuff was it abides, and it continues to be where kind of like a lot of this music, the center of where this music lives. The Moten record you mentioned is long overdue, I think. Fred Moten is, you know, I'd love to hear Harmony talk about it, so I'm not going to say much. I'm just going to say that record, wow, needed it. Harmony, I hope you can maybe pick up and offer any thoughts you might have on Moten in general and that record. But in terms of the weirdness, I mean, like a true legend of the weird was Jamie Branch, who tragically passed away this past year, and who was proud to fly the flag for the freaks of this music and for the truly serious artists who were not caught up in pretense or BS and were not up their own rear ends with it, but were absolutely about what they were saying and about trying to crack our minds and our hearts open. And on my list was an album that she made with Jason Nazary in their group Anteloper. It's essential that people get into her music. So I can't say enough about it. I hope maybe we can play a little bit from that.
Yeah, I definitely didn't want to get to that album. I thought Delphin Rosado on this album was really intense.
Which is a reference to the name of the album, Pink Dolphin. Play that one. I love that song.
All right, Delphin Rosado from the Antelope album. Harmony, you want to talk about Fred Moten a little bit? And then we'll play a little. This Fred Moten album, maybe the only album I've heard that verbally references Finelli's on Prince Street also. So major youth culture, full circle reference there. But yeah, talk to us a little bit about Fred and his writing and the intersection of writing and the music.
Definitely partial, because Fred is a friend, mentor, hero of all poets who are working seriously at this point, I think. And then also my love of jazz sort of began as a writer, poet looking for new forms that weren't represented in the literary canon, and realizing that the jazz canon held some of that energy in those forms, and like an improvisational poetics that we could tap into, that Baraka, Ornette's wife, Jane Cortez, people have been tapping in. Even Cecil Taylor, who's on my list, have, mixed jazz and poetry, but it can be done so horribly that it has to fall out of vogue a decade after it's popular. We need to cycle through it, because it can become this sort of formulaic, terrible inventory of trying to be hip. Like sometimes the crossings of literature and music just become too needy from the literature people, I think. Fred is an example of someone who's able to do it seamlessly, because his poetics, his practice of writing and speech is already so much a musician's practice, that he is already writing in cadences that are like songs more than a lot of poets who primarily worked on the page. And so it was overdue. It was almost, I won't speak for everyone, listen to his lectures. I go back and listen to lectures of his from like 10 years ago as if I'm listening to music. Like when I'm choosing what to listen to in a day, sometimes he's on my playlist and it's like a theoretical lecture on Kant, but it's so lit musically that it feels like listening to music, and your brain or your subconscious is being filled with all of this data that isn't necessarily the same as music. And so that's what he does on this album. And it's just brilliant. If you're going to listen to words spoken over music, this is what to listen to first, I think, and then go backwards.
So let's listen to the opening track off this album, which is The Abolition of Art, The Abolition of Freedom, The Abolition of You and Me.
Ain't there this new way of gathering that's not like that? Like when we do it so pretty, and there's no selling instead of visiting, just this old revolutionary visiting where no one lives in how we fellowship in abolition, which is long and sudden presencing, when Ruth Gilmore undersays it.
I just feel like this is such an exciting moment, and I think I did have more vocalists and more things with words in general on my list this year than in the past, and it wasn't, any concerted effort. I just think this is a really exciting moment when jazz, whatever you choose to define it as, is finally finding itself pretty much back in touch with some version of the zeitgeist. Jazz is rarely on TikTok like Samara Joy, but it is firm-footed on the ground again after a long era of like nostalgia and confusion and like self-flagellating. And now it just feels like jazz musicians are here and they're showing up and they have something to say a lot of the time. And it's not such a fraught exercise. I don't know if you agree with that, Harmony, but I feel like a lot of it is that theory and like critical thinking about where we're at goes really nicely hand in hand with the practice of jazz. And people like Brent Hayes Edwards have written about the way that like jazz musicians have always been writers, and jazz, improvisation is a kind of text in and of itself with a whole lot of intellectual activity going on that you could really get into and sort of analyze on that level. And that might sound esoteric, but I just think now, like, the fact that so many jazz musicians are engaging with ideas in a pretty bold way, the fact that Emmanuel Wilkins asked you, Harmony, to write these beautiful liner notes, and that there is a conversation there, and that Fred Moten is as a performance theorist and then as a poet, is also like, yeah, I want to make a jazz record. The fact that Moor Mother, who's, a sort of post-hip hop, post-punk poet, also feels compelled now to run in the direction of, not away from, the word jazz. Her new album, which I loved, was called Jazz Codes, and really is having this critical conversation about what is jazz in the culture of 2022, what is vacant in a culture that doesn't seem to value this music as much as it could. Like, these are all things that we could have conversations about. We just have to be confident in our ability to do so, not caught up in like, oh, is jazz dead? Oh, is jazz doing the wrong thing? And I feel like that's a nice moment for that.
I think people put serious art forms like jazz, and specifically jazz for some reason, because it taps into so much tenderness and emotions people are afraid to look at that feel messy, through maybe like humiliation rituals almost. Like, there are even decades and series of or eras where it's just embarrassing to be that deep, like where people are in a shallow phase of capitalist, whatever you want to call it, whatever the culture does to people's egos, where they become too big for this tender side of life that jazz taps into and don't want to deal with it. And I think we've gone through like a collective ego death.
So basically, like, jazz is perfectly suited for cringe culture, is what you're saying.
Or for just like for I want to say drama, but more like devastation, like for collective, like reworking of how society is going to behave, because what it's really tapping into outside of the emotionalism is the ability to improvise a new reality in the moment, and I think that's what at our best right now, I don't want to say should, like a didactic person, but that's what the project is right now. I think we have to find a new way to do things, like you're saying, with the labels and the space in London. And there's all sorts of ways that people are doing it, even with electronic music, that to me favors jazz, like Burial, whose album I love from this year, or Actress, who I love out of London. There's a lot of UK, specifically electronic musicians, that for me feel like jazz musicians, and I listen to in the same way, with the same kind of ear.
When you say you listen to them with the same kind of ear, for someone who maybe is coming at those artists from club culture perspective, from, a history of dubstep perspective, what is a jazz ear on Burial, and how might that be different from a dubstep ear on Burial?
I'm listening to the way he's improvising with samples and using like the muffle of a word from a Brandy song or whatever R&B artist he's chosen to sample, almost like he is the vocalist. Like, it's just this embodied music that I sometimes don't even, I love dancing to it too, but that's not what comes to me first. What comes to me first is like the thinking alongside of it in a way, and which is similar to jazz for me.
I just think the Theo Parrish record fits right into that conversation too. If you guys listen to the DJ kicks, so it's a bunch of samples and reappropriations, and definitely is a jazz record, in its own way, for those same reasons you just said.
Moody Man does that for me too. Maybe that's what will bring people back to jazz more and more.
I don't want a hard pivot out of this, but I know both of you feel really connected to Emmanuel Wilkins, and Emmanuel Wilkins has had kind of a bunch of great music in the last few years. And maybe, again, it's a hard pivot out of Actress and Burial and Moor Mother and Janie Branch and so on and so forth. But it does seem like a logical place to kind of tie a bunch of the threads that we've been talking about together. Gio, talk to us a little bit about this album for Emmanuel Wilkins compared to the prior one. What are we adding? What are we moving? I think I was probably more excited about the last album than this one, but tell me a little bit about what he's doing differently here.
So for me, I think Emmanuel Wilkins is this almost like a totemic example right now of like what a young, brilliant jazz musician who masters the tradition or whatever, but then also has a completely unbothered and free relationship to it. Like, what does that look like? What does that sound like? How can it feel? Which is really the critical question. How can it feel to listen to somebody do that? And I feel like for him, there is this tension between organization and disruption or chaos, or a word that he uses a lot, escape. And in the debut record, which you said you preferred, Omega, he has, I think, one like mini suite. On this record, he's got sort of a structure that flows throughout the album, but that doesn't really end in like a neat corner or an end point. It ends in like a complete unfastening, which is to say he starts on track 1 and then goes through to track 7 and sees this as a kind of cycle where the band is getting freer and freer until at the very last point, it's like a 20-minute long free improvisation piece where the same feeling is inherent to it as the more structured, more post-bop. Like, this is a guy who comes out of jazz school writing killer tunes. But on the last track, it's just, you realize that like you've been listening to this person play notes that are more or less somewhere on the tempered scale and that fit into these complex rhythms. But when he loses all that and he just goes completely ape and it like just opens out completely into these bleeding, screaming, arrhythmic proclamations, there's not a lot of distance necessarily between what the first few tracks sounded like and that. Or at least maybe I should say there's not a lot of distance between the feelings. So I guess he just represents to me an artist who wants to say to the world, like, no, don't let go of all that other stuff because it's not holding you down. It's actually just information. And this comes to like this sort of the role that jazz can play for us now, which Harmony, you were talking about, sort of like being tired of the superficial and like tired of the like representing ourselves with public facing explanations of like, here's my feeling today, or here's who I am, here are my, my nouns and my adjectives. Jazz is definitely a space in which you can get into the texture and the nuance a little more. And I think for somebody like Emmanuel Wilkins, he's like, look, I can do that in the present tense. I'm not going to let go of all this valuable information, that comes to me from the generations before. And that was the thing Cecile said in our interview. Cecile McLaurin-Salvant said, I just find it arrogant, she said, that like so many musicians think they just need to reinvent everything anew and not go back,
Exactly.
There's so much humility in going back. And, you listen to somebody like Cecile or like Emmanuel, and you don't necessarily think humility because you think, wow, these people are prodigious, right? They're like incredible. They're just like showing us such an amazing amount of talent. But there is a sense that, okay, no, I can't answer it all myself. I'm going to make references to things that came before because that's what I'm standing on.
Here on Popcast, we are not ahistoric, despite our emphasis on the present. We are not ahistoric.
Your ahistoricity of music news and criticism.
Yeah, real spit. And I appreciate you talking about Wilkins's project in those terms, because I do sometimes, when I look around at state of current criticism about writing about pop music and other genres, I do worry about a resistance to seeing things through a broader lens because it's not expedient or because it's not, frankly, it's not quick and it's not easy. But certainly one of the things we always try to do on the show and certainly in our writing is we're always trying to take in that big picture, even if it's implicit or a nod. And I'm always grateful because I think the jazz episodes, and Gio, I think this is true, we end up landing on a version of this conversation almost every time. But I think it's really instructive to know that this conversation could be had about literally any other thing that we talk about. We can have this conversation about Dua Lipa. We can have this conversation about Bailey Zimmerman. Like, it's like we can have a version of this conversation even if we don't.
Beyonce.
Yes, for sure. Everybody should go back and listen to the 2 Beyonce episodes, which were killers. That's our show. Thank you, Gio. Thank you, Harmony. I appreciate y'all. Listen to every podcast ever at nytimes.com/popcast. Email us at popcast@nytimes.com. Get the t-shirt. It's thepopcast.myshopify.com. Get in the Facebook or the Discord, tinyurl.com/popcast Facebook or /popcast Discord. Subscribe anywhere you get your audio podcast thingies. That's Apple, it's Spotify, it's the other places. Our producer, as always, is Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. What's a great Emmanuel track from this album that we should go out on?
Let's do Don't Break.
Don't Break, Emmanuel Wilkins. We're back next week, y'all.